Okie dokie. Welcome. It's the 20th of March. Dis and that information. I came across a review just a couple of days ago, and it's called Nationalism and Capitalism's Ever-Spiraling Crisis. I will read the whole thing because I think it's a good review, and it compares and contrasts several issues that are important in the current context. That is, uh, to deal with sort of the end part, it does explain, I think, in a reasonable way, and the purpose and why we should be interested in modern money theory. And I think it does a nice, compact way, and also identifies kind of the current situation and where we should be going. The whole review does, I think, in comparing, what does the capitalist state look like? Should we be, in fact, be interested in nationalist elements? And of course, I have my own comments at the end, although I'll begin them at the beginning. That is that I have no problem with the review. It's a good review, excellent, and covers all the most of the key points. I added a couple of diagrams on that help articulate where we are now. That is, I would assert that Trumpism is a patrimonial system. It is, bloody obvious that it is, aside from being misogynist and all the other things. But it is not unlike far too many other nation-state systems of one kind or another. In this particular case, very personality-driven. And ultimately, what will disrupt all of these discussions, like even the review, will be that history will intervene. And I would say that because we haven't had one in a while, and I'm going to be predictive here, even though I don't like being predictive, that there will be probably some major 9/11 type act within the next year or two that will push and pull the politics all over the place. I don't know how major it will be. I don't know if there'll be just scads of minor ones. I think we'll see where that goes. But let me read the review. It'll take up the whole time because it's fairly longish, and as I said, it's a decent little review. Um, it's in I think on a page called Spectre Journal. Nationalism and Capitalism's Ever Spiraling Crisis. It's a review of Wolfgang Streeck's Taking Back Control, question mark, State and State Systems After Globalism, and Jamie Merchant's Endgame on Economic Nationalism and Global Decline. Now, I know that this is, well, I thought I would change up from my yesterday yammering about mathematics, that we would look at something a little bit more didactic and a little bit more up to date and less sort of obtuse, I suppose. Uh, Let me just say that, it is it's a work in progress, and I do think that people need to think about these matters because they still relate, as I've tried to suggest in my other kind of yammering. It's a review by Nick Jacob Wilson. That is, Jacob Wilson is the reviewer who wrote the review of these two texts, Taking Back Control, State and State Systems After Globalism by Wolfgang Streeck, Verso 2024, another new book, Endgame Economic Nationalism and Global Decline by Jimmy Merchant, Reaction Books, an interesting publisher, 2024 also. So these are all very current, and the review itself was posted on the 18th of just a couple days ago. Across the political aisle, it seems as if neoliberalism, financial capitalism, globalization, well, whichever you prefer to call it, has run its course. The enemy of the United States and its residents is no longer terror in the abstract. We're now supposed to fear China for its economic might. The United States' national identity is supposedly under attack from the migrant crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border, and U.S. global hegemony, ooh, the H word, is beginning to fizzle, much to the chagrin of media pundits and war hawks. As its economic and political might wanes, The United States has shown its unwavering commitments to supporting Israel's genocide of Palestinians, re-electing Donald Trump, and rejecting even the most minimal steps to stop the climate crisis. The media narratives are shifting as the punditry is scrambling to make sense of inflation during the COVID-19 pandemic and the rise of, yes, right-wing authoritarianism. The situation looks grim, yet a crisis is also an opportunity, however partial, to intervene into the permanently unstable ground of our global economy. This is perhaps the critical edge of Marxian analysis, which has historically made light of capitalism's spectacular failures and horrendous successes. As of late, and thanks to the rightward lurch of global politics, the nation-state has made a surprising comeback. Many are ringing the bell for nationalist protectionism and an end to globalization. For instance, some have asked if capitalism was killed and usurped by a new era of techno-feudalism. Anton Jager has suggested the concept of hyperpolitics to periodize the decline of U.S. empire, and Robert Brenner and Dylan Riley have argued for the concept of political capitalism to understand our trying times. While diverging on a number of points, it seems plenty clear from the literature that the state and nationalism figure prominently in today's political landscape. With that, if we are to historicize this period adequately, it seems prudent to evaluate how Marxists theorize the state, along with how they should relate to the national question. Let me break here for a moment and recall that, yes, the national question is very important. It's clear that it connects to all kinds of other things of the last couple of centuries, including, of course, colonialism, imperialism, and all that stuff. Two recently published texts responding to the crisis that capitalist society finds itself in offer illuminating analyses for those considering the national question today. The first, an English translation of Wolfgang Streeck's 2021 work, Taking Back Control, mounts a study of the ways that globalism has closed off the possibility for democracy and what can be done to restore democratic control of the economy to the general populace in the 21st century. The second, the debut monograph from Jamie Merchant, entitled Endgame, scrutinized global economic decline and the emergence of what he calls economic nationalism through a Marxian lens. These texts both analyze the majority of what some call the advanced capitalist countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, Japan, and China, while also suggesting how economic decline breeds right-wing revolt. Now, while both operate on distinct theoretical terrains, with Streeck showing his heritage in John Maynard Keynes and Karl Polanyi, while Merchant adheres to a communist horizon, their works offer moments of complementary analysis and points for further debate for careful readers. Now, the underlying question for both Streeck and Merchant is whether nationalism and the nation-state can be a vehicle for radical change today. Now, this is an old question for the left, to which Streeck and Merchant offer competing answers. In the following, that is Jacob, the writer, offer a comparative and dynamic analysis of the argumentative lines of Taking Back Control and Endgame 2, perhaps think more dialectically about nationalism in the 21st century. My resulting argument is that the nation-state is an inadequate institution to solve the problems of global economic decline. While nationalist rhetoric and appeals appear like a guiding light under the long shadow cast by globalization, such political imaginaries share liberalism's fantasies of a rationalized world. Now, the rest of this review essay is organized into three sections. The first will turn to the parts of these works that analyze the conditions of capitalist accumulation in order to understand their theorization of capitalist society and the decline of globalization. The second section will then turn to their responses to this decline and elucidate their treatment of the national question within the conditions of the 21st century. Now, by way of conclusion, the third section then points toward further considerations regarding the role of nationalism today. Falling globe, rising nation. Streeck and Merchant both diagnosed the advanced capitalist countries' decline in profitability and consequent decline in investment in productive labor. In the hopes of reviving these declining rates of return, a glut of speculative investments have cropped up that have shielded money from democratic control and indirectly propped up the global market. The two authors begin to diverge in their explanations of the consequences of these interlocking phenomena. For Streeck, showing his intellectual heritage from Karl Polanyi and John Maynard Keynes, the decline in profitability results in an unequal distribution of incomes and wealth, which makes consumption of goods, and therefore the renewal of the system nearly impossible. For Streeck, finance capital, or neoliberalism, has left behind massive piles of public debt and a bloated global money supply, which leaves large swaths of money across the world in limbo, looking for a place to be reinvested profitably. This only reinforces the unequal distribution of wealth, compelling the further centralization of industry into the hands of the few. Since money is not subject to any kind of democratic decision-making, although it should be, this amounts to another way in which the capitalist system dictates the general direction of national economies in the service of the capitalist class. Streeck extends this explanation to the political consequences of the declining profit rate by noting the right wing's response to this receding democratic control of the economy through a rising authoritarianism. He historicizes the neoliberal counter-revolution, we've talked about this before, and globalization, noting that nation-states have seen exceptional population growth, dependency on global value chains, and financial imperialism abroad due to the increasingly unregulated financial sector. In contrast to the prevailing understanding of neoliberalism, these tendencies have led to the increasing use of the state to manage these developments. Streeck calls this authoritarian response mega-statism, or großstaaterei, which he understands as the consequence of relinquishing control of national economies over to the invisible hand of the global free market. So, rather than a way to shrink the nation-state, neoliberal globalization was in fact a way for nation-states to find new avenues for competitive advantage for their own firms, while aligning state capacities to protect these avenues at all costs. Yet, Streeck is clear in saying that the abolition of statehood in favor of technocracy, see where we're headed here, or rule by the market was never a real possibility, as it was always a myth in order to concretize U.S. financial imperialism and hegemony. According to Streeck, the contradictory dynamic makes the nation-state as it is presently organized an unwieldy institutional lever by which to govern society. Streeck uses the COVID crisis as an example, arguing that the facilitation of cross-border capitalist expansion does not permit a realistic calculation or efficient allocation of the costs of globalization, and thereby condemns the global regime to structural impossibility. In short, the problem today lies in the fact that nations are too big to be governed and cannot be held accountable to maintaining the speculative promises of a global economy for society at large. Therefore, nation-states fail to keep the unfettered, undemocratic capitalist world system in check. It's for these reasons that he advocates for a return to small statism, to focus on national concerns and bring the capitalist economy under democratic control. As he argues, the nation-state is the only institution capable of asserting the primacy of politics over the economy, or indeed, the political primacy of society over capitalism in the face of hyperglobalization. Now, Merchant, on the other hand, finds Streeck's dream of subsuming the economic to the political a convenient fantasy. Merchant's retention of the concept of totality, we've talked about this before, which Chris O'Kane defines as a theory that grasps history and or capitalist society as an interconnected whole from an emancipatory perspective, renders his approach to the rate of profit unique. Rather than demarcating the political and economic as two separate spheres of influence in social life, Merchant instead insists on their fundamental relationship within capitalist society as a totality. Consequently, for Merchant, The rise of right-wing politics is not a symptom of the failure to wield political power over capitalism, but of the breakdown tendencies of the totality of capitalism as experienced within given nation states. Merchant asserts that the decline in the rate of profit is not the cause of bad governance, nor is it caused by a leech-like financial sector sapping the profits of industry, or a dominant national economy outcompeting the rest of the world. Instead, Merchant shows a decline in investment in productive activities, that is, those activities where labor creates surplus value, across the world capitalist system since the 1970s. And there's plenty of evidence for that. Investments in production in the advanced capitalist countries are becoming increasingly unprofitable, which makes firms race to the bottom, scouring the planet for the cheapest labor, disproportionately in the global south, while relying on subcontractors to foot the costs of producing goods or processing natural resources. Further division and specialization of firms delays capitalism's inevitable collapse and temporarily raises specific states and their domestic industries' competitive advantages and rates of profit. Yet, as gains in productivity become generalized across the board, growth begins to dwindle again, and with it, the world capitalist system. The United States, rather than protecting the system with which it has achieved world hegemony, is now the principal country disintegrating it, enacting protectionist policies whose most important effect will not be to revive the U.S. economy, much less the world's, but to set off a ruinous arms race of competing regimes around the world. By finding the source of economic decline and the political turn to protectionist policies within capitalist relations of production, Merchant can explain the contemporary rise in nationalism. Merchant argues that as economic growth dissipates, mass frustration spreads, and ever more people hold politicians, Chuck Schumer, as those who are supposed to be able to do something about it in utter contempt. Tantalizing narratives of right-wing populists, fascists, and authoritarians like Trump become all the more persuasive. This is where Merchant's concept of economic nationalism allows him to explore how various pundits, politicians, and ideologues are now receding into the borders of their nationalities to emphasize the need to protect our economy, assets, or property from unfair competition or foreign ownership. In this way, Merchant offers the strongest explanation and criticism of the rise nationalist rhetoric of all political flavors by situating it within the decline of U.S. empire and the transnational movement of global capitalism. At its core, economic nationalism claims that the wealth generated inside a country belongs solely to its legal citizens, that the economic policy should reflect that. It opposes globalism and advocates more domestic control over the economy, locating the essence of democracy in national sovereignty. With both left-wing and right-wing versions of this core ideology calling to decouple from the global economy, economic nationalism may seem like the only response to liberalism's epic failures. This focus on the nation allows capitalists to use foreign threats to align state capacities toward nationalistic ends in order to protect the basis for the rule of the bourgeois class. National governments enthusiastically comply to these measures, since their existence is inextricably tied to the health and vigor of their domestic capitalist class. By pursuing partial solutions to problems that economic nationalism cannot solve, the nation state is weaponized by the capitalist class in an effort to stabilize what will be always an unstable social and economic system. Seeing no exit, capitalists are now concerned with protecting what little they have and using the state as a strong arm to direct investment in state policies to protect their class position at all costs. This response shows the general indifference of the capitalist system to the rest of the world. Capitalism is not only unable to resolve social contradictions, but now being used in a way that actively deepens them. Merchant emphasizes the permanent crisis conditions of capitalism and argues that economic nationalism, as a political response, simply prolongs its demise, providing neither a full nor partial solution to the transnational problem of capitalist accumulation. For Merchant, the return to nationalism is a reactionary project caught up in the fantasy of technocratic control over an uncontrollable economy. The capitalist world system, as Merchant explains, is like a circular firing squad in which the pursuit of productivity by all participants results in a general desolation for them all. Now, against these warnings, Streeck offers a narrative of neoliberalism which focuses on the growing imbalance in decision making and control of the world's money supply, which causes discontent with politicians, fueling the far right's ascendancy and the capitalist system's ungovernability. Streeck maintains that the nation state is the only means of returning democratic control over the economy and rationally organizing it. In this sense, Streeck maintains faith in the nation state as an actor to control capitalism's excesses. Thus, the crux of the disagreement between Streeck and Merchant is the latter's, that is, Merchant's, understanding of the nation state as determined by capitalism's global relations of production, in contrast to the former, Streeck's view of the nation state's relative autonomy from those global relations under particular conditions. Question the answer. If one were to understand the state as an agent in history, it can be reasonable to comprehend the last 50 years as capitalism's whittling away of states' capacities to act on behalf of the majority of humanity. To reassert the state over and above the market is an understandable response after decades of austerity, which is where we are now, and the dubious increases in worker productivity as wages stagnate. Streeck's work is illustrative here since he provides a strong rationale for what he calls a downward exit from the post-neoliberal stalemate in order to reassert the political over the irrational economic sphere. Importantly, in Streeck's imagination, it would require a heavily regulated financial sector with strict controls on the movement of capital between nation states, while also fixing tax codes to account for asset inflation and inheritances, this is Piketty, so as to curb wealth inequality. This requires that the prevailing megastates of neoliberalism be encouraged to produce for their own local context rather than for export markets, which he asserts is the only way to achieve a robust social safety net protected from the vultures of finance. As the title of his work, that is, Taking Back Control, suggests, Streeck is by and large more optimistic that non-imperialist small statism is capable of taking back control of the market and reining in the excesses of capital growth. This would grant agency to the state to overrule the imbalance of decision-making power in the present economy by affirming democracy as the pillar of society. Again, in the context of global economic turmoil in the wake of COVID-19, it would seem prudent to withdraw from international interdependencies and consider how conscious economic organization and cooperation can remake society along more just and equal lines by directing production for national aims. While these prospects seem promising for weary and tired leftists, there are some counter-revolutionary tendencies that we can glean from Streeck's proposals that are representative of the wider turn to nationalist politics. Even though Streeck affirms his work on the grounds of political theory, he vacates a political understanding of nationalism early on in his work, saying that he uses it as a, quote, neutral characterization of a mode of political action based on the nation state and in pursuit of the collective interests it stands for, which may but need not be associated with international aggressiveness or disparagement of other nations on racist or other grounds, unquote. Considering its history, nationalism is always an assertion of a distinct people against some other, and the nation is the protection and legal fortification of a particular people's call for self-determination against that other. From Streik's advantage, the problem of the return to nationalism becomes a problem of authoritarians who want to use it for exclusionary and racist projects. If the right group could use the nation for the collective interests of everyone, then maybe the nation state might be wielded for truly democratic and socialist ends. Or that is at least Streik's hope. Now, Merchant throws cold water on the economic realities of a downward exit by showing the imbrication of global decline and national decline. In particular, his chapters on imperialism and modern monetary theory are tours through the left's attempts to respond to global decline through appeals to national sovereignty and the power of the state to regulate the economy. The critique of imperialism is particularly important here since a downward exit, as imagined by Streik, would require that countries maintain small statehoods that are somehow cooperative and non-imperialist. This is only possible since Streik defines imperialism as an economic phenomenon in political terms as the product of the drive for power by authoritarian figures. As Merchant points out, these figures would pursue power simply for the sake of getting more power, a tautology of epic proportions. Rooting imperialism as the effect of political choices is dubious, considering that capitalism effectuates its own form of impersonal power behind the backs of producers, driving them outward and into imperialist expansion, Koch brothers, etc. That is, an appropriate understanding of the relationship between imperialism and capitalism entails a view of imperialism as a systemic, rather than personal feature of the world system. You know, it's a feature, not a bug. By showing how overproduction is a constant feature of a society in which declining profit rates shape global competition, Merchant is able to situate imperialism as, quote, just business as usual in the capitalist world economy, unquote. In his account, overproduction is a feature of society of producers who independently produce their goods, yet are reliant upon commodity exchange to organize the production of these goods. See Marx. Instability is the defining characteristic of capitalism. That's imperialism that ensures capitalism can reproduce itself on an ever-expanding scale to absorb the surplus product. To this day, capitalism's drive for profit remains the same. It requires that nation states, because they rely on the capitalist class for their own existence, pursue imperialist aims in order to reproduce society. In this way, imperialism is not something that can be waved away through savvy politics. It is a structural feature of capitalist society and consequently leads to the accumulation of wealth by the few at the expense of the many. To argue that we can reach some non-imperial capitalist consensus with democracy is virtually impossible. So with that, and in what is probably one of the best texts on modern monetary theory, MMT, from a Marxian perspective, Merchant persuasively turns to criticizing a recent post-Keynesian craze that would theoretically allow economists to circumvent the need for imperialist growth by leveraging a nation's national debt to fund itself. According to its proponents, MMT is a reversal of economic orthodoxy that puts the state in the driver's seat of the economy, allowing it to take control of capitalism through thrifty spending and taxation, as Stephanie Kelton argues. Now, rather than the typical barter myth, which is used to explain the necessity of money to facilitate the exchange of goods, MMT posits that money originates in the nation-state's ability to tax, thus positioning the nation-state as a central actor that stands over and above the economy. In other words, MMT imagines the state as a relatively autonomous actor which can intervene in strategic ways to balance the economy by buying and selling treasury bonds in order to keep inflation down and employment rates high. Positioning the state in such a way would unleash it from its current marginal role in managing monetary policy by adjusting interest rates to curb the consumption of its residents. Now, by giving the state more tools, MMT conceptualizes the state into a powerful tool for economists to rationalize an irrational market. Central to MMT is its claim to obviate the need for countries with sovereign currencies to experience the worst of boom and bust cycles typical of capitalism, since the state is able to intervene in a much more active way by minimizing financial risk and funding social programs to protect a state's people. Merchant shows that MMT's claims that the state can fund the public projects and social programs crumbling in the wake of neoliberalism ultimately rely on the same ideological pretenses of Keynesian theory, which holds that, quote, governments are capable of dissolving social conflicts through the scientific rule of a techno-philosophical elite who see through the clash of competing interests to govern in the general interest, unquote. According to Merchant, MMT obscures the state's role in shoring up capitalism as a transnational system and the class structure necessary to support it. Merchant argues that this occlusion has its origins in money's fetish character. Following Marx, money is a means to represent equal amounts of human labor by measuring time, which consequently obscures the concrete characteristics of human labor. Without money, it's much more difficult to equate the labor of a school teacher and the labor of a construction worker, as their labor is qualitatively different. In abstracting from labor's concrete characteristics and treating them as equal amounts of quote unquote human labor, see value, money can take on a life of its own by appearing valuable in and for itself, making its alienated form of power all the more real as, quote, relationships between human beings that take on an impersonal existence independent of its creators and in turn dominate them. This last point is uniquely important for Merchant's argument. Money's fetish character escapes the conscious intentions of politicians and economists. It drives home the central contradiction at the heart of the U.S. capitalist state, which is at once posited as governing in the interest of a given populace and at the same time defending its currency as the universal means of exchange. Humans are dominated by what we do in order to survive under capitalism, and the same is true for governments like the United States, which are compelled to bend to the international pressures of the global capitalist system at the expense of everyone. According to Merchant, MMT's attempt to fix a transnational problem with national monetary policy is not possible, since the monetary sovereign does not fully control its own currency as world money, despite, reserve currency, but remains subordinated to it and condemned to serve its own creation, unquote. By presenting the impersonal compulsions underlying the money form, Merchant is able to show how attempts to resolve the issue of the declining agency of the state to improve the lives of workers only prolongs its inevitable collapse. In doing so, he gives the lie to Streeck's dreams. Merchant's criticism of economic nationalism in both its left and right varieties begs the question as to what he proposes as a solution. The last chapter of his work sketches three terrains of class struggle and how they confront capitalism in what he calls the stage, the shop, and the street. It is here that Merchant opens new questions of the possible terrains in which class struggle is waged, while resisting definitive answers to the problems of resurgent national movements and economic decline. One might say that this sidesteps the necessary task of thinking ahead in concrete, actionable steps, given that more than ever we need analyses of organizing capacities. However, I would argue that it is precisely this analysis that Merchant provides here. Instead of prescribing, Merchant leaves open the possibility of multiple fronts, which, from electoral runs to labor organizing to insurrectionary protests, have all recently demonstrated their capacity to make capitalists shiver in fear, barbecuing Teslas. Of and for conflict, respectively, and in their own way, Merchant and Streeck ask readers to consider capitalism's crisis conditions and, importantly, be ready to take advantage of them. Endgame provides readers with a critical gaze with which to cast upon the totality, showcasing the enduring clarity of Marxian theory and its ability to pierce through our ideological veils, to open up the possibility for new struggles. Taking back control offers a controversial rationale to turn back to the nation state as a space for political organization after decades of neoliberal globalization. Where Streeck finds an answer, Merchant finds an impossibility premised on a misreading of the space afforded states within the totality of capitalism. Now, unity might be appealing under the guise of national interests, but as Vladimir Lenin adamantly held, the horizon for Marxists needs to be international solidarity among proletarians. Given Merchant's own astute analysis of economic nationalism, it's less certain than Streeck that he can theorize and adequately answer whether the left needs to organize around national interests today at the level of abstraction at which his analysis is pitched. To properly answer this question, we should imagine going to local struggles to organize where the possibilities for radical change are more concrete and tied to conditions of social reproduction. For instance, the Gaza solidarity encampments last year in the United States and across the world are one recent way in which support for national sovereignty opened the possibility for international solidarity. The calls for university divestment and the rising awareness of these institutions' complicity in Israel's genocide in Gaza displayed the contradictory positions of capitalism and nation states to democratically govern in the service of people, when they're subservient to the demands of U.S. weapons manufacturers itching to sell their missiles and border surveillance technologies. The work of illuminating the contradictory positions of the world system is exactly why the Palestinian struggle is an international cause of utmost importance. Palestinian resistance and solidarity illustrates the many ways in which the capitalist world system is blindly driven by the pursuit of profit above humanity. Now, until then, the Marxian left would do well resisting the temptation of organizing along national lines to confront capitalism until we can definitely answer how, in this moment of resurgent right-wing nationalism and authoritarianism, it can or will lead to international unity among proletarians. The right's discursive dominance over nationalism suggests the need for more analysis that measures organizational capacities in the local context. Only such an analysis can determine whether this is a battle worth fighting. The pragmatism of the capitalist system and its ideologues lies in the very fact that it could care less if nations exist or not. It will align itself with whomever or whatever will keep it floating along. If one is going to pursue the national line, they will need to confront the contradictions of capitalist consciousness within the specific economic conditions that states beholden to local capitals find themselves in during the 21st century. Now, otherwise, the nation becomes primed for the sort of counter-revolutionary efforts of the capitalist class and for falling back into little more than clearing the way for generalized commodity production. Perhaps instead of seeing the nation as an endpoint of organizing in the case of drumming up national unity, the left should recognize the nation as a space confronted with historically specific problems that can serve the means of organizing against capitalism on an international scale. Now, just because the nation is what we have today, we do not have to accept its vision for the future. We can, however, take advantage of the way the nation unites people along shared negative experiences of it and its capitalist projects, uniting across these differences. Suffering in different ways under capital-driven nation states points to the shared reality of the nation as often merely a vehicle for capitalist growth. Drawing upon these contradictions keeps the possibilities for international solidarity open. While acknowledging how each nation is presented with real historical problems. If one looks at the uniquely American experience with healthcare services, it's easy to see how the United States as a nation presents a negative determination of its residents by making medical services available for only those who can pay. Now, if the murder of United Healthcare what happened?
Oh,
Sorry. Let me start. If one looks at uniquely American experience with healthcare services, it's easy to see how the United States as a nation presents a negative determination of its residents by making medical services available for only those who can pay. If the murder of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson has said anything about the U.S. healthcare system, it is the fact that the majority of people see through the veil of insurance, including federally subsidized marketplaces for insurance, and know that they want something else. Thompson's murder brought to the surface the barbarous, impersonal qualities of insurance companies as they subject human lives to ever more misery while they chase around wads of blood-soaked cash. Whether a sustaining fight will emerge is another question. It is a reminder of the fissure points and fragility of the nation state and its mythos. As more contradictions of the nation are cast out of the shadows, revolutionary fervor will surely build up and become the basis for something otherwise. Well, let's all hope so. But until then, we just have to look at stuff. I've included a video. You have to use the link below about it has Paul Maddock, a very important person to listen to, but also it includes Jamie Merchant in this video. It's about an hour and a half, and we're not going to watch it. You can, of course. Money and Capital in the 21st Century has come out recently. And another one promoted by our friends at ValleyVox. It's a documentary called Endeavor. Well, it's by Endeavor, Endeavor Group, I guess. The New American Oligarchs: Who Rules the U.S.? And you can see there's a picture of Elmo and what's his name from The Social Network. um, anyway, I included a diagram that will give you a better sense of this. People, leftists, talk about the state a lot. One should think about what counts as state development, because that's clearly the issue for imperialism or neocolonialism or globalization, that the state is an important entity in all these processes. It includes, of course, state formation, violence monopolization, which is happening currently, state building, which is a transition from patrimonial rule to bureaucratic administration. And you can see that's going on now, where the bureaucratic administration, i.e., the federal government, is under attack by patrimonial rule, i.e., the Elon and Krasnov show. So that's important to remember. And it is not a new theory. It's certainly been there for a while. But state development, of course, applies in greater amounts for the global south as opposed to the global north. And then I put in a little diagram here for the idea of domination, patrimonialism, and then, of course, in the more traditional historical model, sultanism. Unless you think that's unimportant, you can see in various elements of the Indo-Pacific where sultanism is actually part of the deal. Brunei comes to mind. But anyway, and so you have double diminished subtype, neo-patrimonialism, Eric Prince wanting to become the viceroy of Afghanistan I would assert to be a neo-sultanist subtype. Anyway, so the typology is fairly clear, and I think you need to point this out to various parties when you have to get in a little fight with people about the ostensive stupidity of stuff. So that's my little yammering for today. I got to the end, thank goodness. Let me thank you for your attention, and I will go and